order. Welcome to meeting 116 of the House of Commons of Standing Committees on Veteran Affairs. Conformément à l'article 108 du
Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 29th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study on the experience of Indigenous veterans and Black veterans. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format. Observations must be directed towards the chair. Today, as witnesses, we have the following. Quite sadly, we won't be able to have Dr. Lynn Guliker due to sound issues, but we will receive her opening remarks and share them with the committee later, and she can stay online and listen in. We have from the Canadian War Museum, Dr. Michael Petru, historian, Veterans Experience. So, welcome. You have 5 to 6 minutes for your opening remarks, and then members of the committee will ask you some questions. On to you.
Mr. Duval, and thank you all for having me. As the chair said, my name is Michael Petru, and I am the historian of the Veterans Committee. Excuse me, I'm the historian of the Veterans Experience at the Canadian War Museum. I spent the last 3 years at the museum leading an oral history project called In Their Own Voices, which explores the post-war and post-service lives of Canadian veterans and their loved ones. It's not a history of war. In other words, it's a history of the ripples of war and of military service. We wanted to better understand how veterans and their loved ones are shaped by their service. So to this end, I have interviewed more than 200 veterans and their relatives, from 104-year-old veterans of the Second World War to much younger returnees from Afghanistan and Iraq and peacetime service. So these interviews, totaling hundreds of hours, were conducted by phone, by Zoom, but mostly face-to-face in kitchens and living rooms across the country. And they reveal that for many veterans, the war continues long after the rest of us stop paying attention. They reveal that the impacts of service continue in ways that are profound, intimate, and far-ranging, cascading across decades and sometimes generations. So I can share a bit of what I've learned in the course of this research with you today, but I would encourage you all to consult the In Their Own Voices online exhibition. It contains 50 excerpts from those interviews, but also access to all 200 interviewed transcripts through the museum's Military History Research Center. This is an incredibly rich resource. Again, hundreds of hours of interviews. Our hope is that this will be of use to members of the public, researchers, scholars, students, family members, but it's also designed precisely for the sort of work that you're all undertaking. So I hope you'll make use of it, and I hope it will help. Because this committee is focused on the experiences of Black and Indigenous veterans, I should note that approximately 26 of the In Their Own Voices interviewees are Indigenous and 11 are Black. We also have testimonies from Asian, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, Jewish, and LGBTQ+ veterans and their loved ones. So I can speak to some of the common themes that have emerged with Black and Indigenous veterans, but I should begin by noting that many, if not most, of the most deeply held and deeply felt experiences of Black and Indigenous veterans are ones that are common to veterans of all backgrounds and of all eras and of all wars and periods of service. Everybody is shaped by their service. That transition from being a service member to being a civilian is a profound one, often meaningful, sometimes unsettling. I recall one veteran of Bosnia and Afghanistan who likened the process of becoming a civilian again to crossing a bridge from one bank of a river to the next. The near bank is familiar, it feels safe, you know people there, they understand you, but you need to get across to the other bank, which is not familiar. You haven't been there since you were a teenager maybe. It's unfamiliar, it's forbidding, but you know you need to push yourself across that bridge. Eventually you reach the far bank, and with luck and support you become comfortable there. So I think we can divide some of the challenges surrounding the transition to veteranhood into two main clusters. There's the practical challenge, finding a job, maybe healthcare, a place to live. And then there is the emotional transition. Your identity changes. You are now separated from people that you could rely on completely, that you trusted with your life. You might not have liked them, but you loved them. They understood you. And now you're surrounded by people who don't really understand you or what you've done. This can be disquieting, this can be lonely. So this transition, the challenges surrounding this transition, this is common across, again, regardless of the background, regardless of whether the veteran is black or indigenous, regardless of the era they served in. I think often of a veteran of Afghanistan who described coming home from the war, and there was a family gathering, a birthday or something like that, and he was at the table, and someone mentioned the name of one of his comrades who had died. And it became too much for him. He started to cry, and he had to leave the table. And his grandfather followed him into the hallway and simply put his arm around his shoulder and said, "It's okay, I understand." Now, his grandfather was usually a boisterous type. This was out of character. But his grandfather was a veteran of the Second World War. So their wartime experiences were separated by decades, by vast distance. But they shared that most intimate, most unique, most profound experience of losing people close to them in combat. And as a result, they understood each other despite these differences in a way that perhaps other people couldn't. Now, there are certain themes that are unique to black and indigenous, perhaps other racialized service members as well. One is veteranhood as a tool for social mobility, for advancing social and political equity. I think of Chinese and Japanese Canadian veterans of the Second World War who used their veteranhood as a tool for advancing post-war equity. I should say that this is not equally effective. Many indigenous veterans of the Second World War did not have access to the same sort of Veterans Charter settlements after the war. Many, nevertheless, of the post-war political leaders and First Nations were veterans, and that continues to be the case today. Black interviewees spoke often as veteranhood as a way of proving their families bona fides that they belong in this country, either because of their own service or because of their family's service. Another common theme, I think, concerns the tensions or the wrestling between levels of discrimination inside the service and outside. One black veteran described the process of leaving the military after many years, where he felt more judged on his merits as opposed to the color of his skin, and returning to Canadian society where racism was more profound. He described that as a culture shock. I should say that this equity is, of course, not uniform, and it's not attested to by all veterans, and some speak of discrimination even amongst fellow veterans when they return to civilian life. One Indigenous veteran recalled the feeling that he was good enough to die beside his non-Indigenous service members, but not good enough to have a drink with them in the Legion. I know I'm running out of time, but if you'll permit me just to speak briefly to two themes that I think are perhaps unique to Indigenous veterans, and they're both related to the role of Indigenous veterans in their community. And the risk of overgeneralizing, I think the role of a veteran in Indigenous communities is often unique, perhaps more important than in non-Indigenous communities. We see this reflected, for example, in the grand entries in prairie powwows. This comes with greater prestige, but also responsibility and attendant stress. The last theme I'd like to mention concerns questions about being an Indigenous veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces when Canada hasn't always treated Indigenous people well or fairly. As one Indigenous veteran put it, we fought under a flag that didn't always protect us. At least two Indigenous veterans spoke of being called a traitor for serving in the Canadian military. He responded by saying he felt sorry for the person who made this accusation, because that person would never know the love and the joy that he felt from service. But everybody has different reasons. Certain Indigenous veterans have spoke of serving because of love for the land. But I think often of an Indigenous veteran from down east, a Mi'kmaq, whose explanation was rooted in history. He said that his people had signed treaties with the British Crown and now the Canadian Crown, and by serving he was simply upholding his end of the bargain. I think there's an implication there about upholding the other end of the bargain as well. I'll end there, but again, I conducted hundreds of hours of interviews, and there's a lot more to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
That's okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Michael Petru. And we still have problem with Mrs. Gulliger, so we're going to start the first round of questions. And I invite Mr. Terry Dodell for 6 minutes, please. Mr. Dodell, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and part of our Black and Indigenous study. It's unfortunate that one is not going to be on here, but anyway, you're going to probably get lots of questions, just so be prepared today. So, Dr. Petru, it was interesting in your opening remarks. You talked about, for the most part, most of the issues are common to all veterans, and mostly was shaped by service. So, and then you went on to say as well that 11 blacks, 26 Indigenous. Can you just elaborate a little quick? I know the Indigenous, you had quite a few more comments. What were some of the bigger issues within the black community that you heard? You had 11 respondents.
Sure. I mean, there are, and again, I can only speak to the 11 and what I learned from those interviews, and I think everybody's experience is different. The common themes, I think, that emerge amongst black veterans is certainly the idea of service as a path for social mobility. One veteran spoke of being motivated. He spoke of coming home, and so this is not so much social mobility, perhaps more of social change, but coming home, and as a result of what he perceived to be greater levels of equity inside the armed service, that was more of a motivation for him to push against unofficial segregation, some of the discrimination in his own community in Nova Scotia. A common theme also that has emerged, again, is this idea of veteranhood as a path for social mobility. Veterans, including family members, I should say, in interviews would point to the service of perhaps an ancestor that fought in the First World War. This is two black interviewees I'm thinking of, to say your grandfather, your great-grandfather served in the First World War, in this case fought at Vimy Ridge. That's kind of your ticket to belonging here. It shouldn't be, but when your identity as a Canadian is questioned, you have this tool to push back and say, this is what my family has done. We have been here since after the American Revolution. We have served here, here, and here, and here. We served at Vimy Ridge, for goodness sakes. This is a talisman. This is proof that we belong here. That was a common theme as well. Again, the third one that I would point to again is this, and again, I different people have different experiences, but this idea that there was, and I'm not suggesting that the armed forces was painted as a idyllic a place where racism was absent, but this shift of being in Canadian society and then into the military society, and feeling one could thrive more based on their own merits in the military, and then that would lead to also some of the perhaps uncomfortable transitions when you leave the military and you're back in Canadian society, and that greater equity is gone. Again, I mentioned the veteran who called it a culture shock.
So In your study and your video of their own voices, and talking with as many people as you did in your study, often I think it's when we're sitting here in this committee, there's their service when they're actually deployed and part of the Canadian Armed Forces, and then there's Veterans Affairs that they deal with. Did you find in their discussions with Black and Indigenous and actually probably all veterans in your study that the equality is that they experienced, or inequality, I guess, that they experienced in the CAF carried on with their actions with Veterans Affairs after leaving the military?
I think there's certain frustrations with Veterans Affairs that have, are common amongst all veterans, but I've also heard very positive and gratitude from both Black. I'm thinking specifically of a couple of Indigenous veterans right now, with help from Veterans Affairs with that transition in terms of counseling and other forms of assistance. Now,
could you highlight what those issues are that perhaps weren't up to the standard they should be, so that perhaps
well, I'm not saying the same. I'm thinking of more positive reflections. I'm thinking of a veteran that spoke positively of veterans of the military and then Veterans Affairs help with battling alcoholism, for example, during the transition out of service into veteranhood. A number of veterans have spoken, have benefited from counseling provided through Veterans Affairs to deal with PTSD, for example. And again, this is constant across Indigenous, Black, and non-Indigenous or non-Black veterans. Again, certain veterans have expressed frustration.
Is there a common feed in that frustration? Because that's what we're trying to probably. Yeah,
when it gets to I should be clear that the majority of these interviews centered more on the emotional and identity transition of veterans. I would not feel qualified to critique specific policies pertaining to veterans and where they fall short or where they do well. Again, I can talk about some of the criticism that veterans have voiced. These are often very specific about access to health care or certain benefits and levels of disability. But the nuts and bolts of policy, I'm not in a position to dive into that.
Okay, and then just a little bit of time? I guess just quickly in your project, Their Own Voices, can you outline probably the most important support factors for veterans and their loved ones who are often not thought of quite to the same extent that allow them to transition post-service and successfully to continue to contribute here in Canada?
Yeah, I can try. To be honest, though, I'm not sure if it's something the government can solve. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is it's the loneliness. It's a dislocation. You go from one community to another community. I remember one veteran who lives in Ottawa. He says, I live in a city of 1 million people and nobody knows what I did, and that's disquieting. There's a certain dislocation there. I don't know if government can solve that. We live in a society where most Canadians have spent the last 10 years trying to forget that we ever were in Afghanistan. But veterans that were there have not forgotten. That continues in their life. So there's that disconnect between the lived experience of veterans and...
We need the public to learn of the sacrifices that they made. I think we need to do a better job.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dordel. And now let's go to Mr. Randip Sarai for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Petro. It reminded me when you spoke. My father was a World War II veteran, and a lot of when they went to World War II from India, some called them traitors too because they had a colonial power and they're fighting for the colonial power. And afterwards, but they felt that very similar to what your contractual relationship was saying, that they got the colonial power out post World War II, and subsequently in Canada and other places in the Commonwealth, they were able to get the right to vote post World War II, so they kind of earned that right. And very similarly, I've noticed you saying about some people feeling not welcome in legions and other places in Canada. And I remember the incident in Newton Legion in Surrey way back where they wouldn't allow Sikhs with turbans to enter because they said it's disrespect to the Queen. And the Queen was actually very cordial, invited all 4 of them and had tea with them later to say that it was not disrespect there. But many ethnicities and nationalities have gone through this, and it reminds me that we haven't moved far enough. Can you share a few examples from the project that highlight the contributions of Black veterans and their struggles for recognition in Canada?
I think Kathy Grant will be speaking to the committee after me. She might be in better place to speak to that. I should say, just again, with the effort of fully reflecting these interviews, there are at least 2 Black veterans I think of who were trailblazers in terms of what they accomplished, and while being proud of that, were also uncomfortable with being singled out as being the first, as they put it, the first Black this or the first Black that. So, I mean, certainly, I've been lucky to speak to Black veterans that were at the forefront of change, whether that would be, being, the first Black woman who was a fighter pilot, or, other, the ancestors of some of the few Black First World War veterans. And again, there's pride in that. But to fully reflect what's been told, there's also Black veterans that, I don't want to say that, again, like proud of what they accomplished as Black veterans, but also maybe perhaps a little bit uneasy about being singled out for being Black. So I don't want to, I'm trying to capture the nuances of these interviews, and people's experiences are deeply felt, but they're also highly personal. So I'm trying to highlight certain themes, but I'm also a little bit cautious about painting an all-encompassing picture, if that makes sense.
Moving on to Indigenous peoples, they've had a long history of military service. Your research and work at the museum, how would you say the experience of Indigenous veterans during World Wars and later conflicts differed due to their cultural or societal backgrounds?
Well, veterans, I'm thinking of David Gamble, a veteran from around 1990 to 1996, who served as the Grand Chief of the Saskatchewan First Nations Veterans Association. He's the one that I mentioned who talked about serving under a flag that didn't always protect us. So the post-Second World War Veterans Charter, again, it was not, in writing, this legislation was not restricted to certain ethnicities or backgrounds. In practice, when it came to access to land, to grants, to finances, Indigenous people did not benefit to the same degree that non-Indigenous people did. I mean, Mr. Gamble's words were, they were given land that already belonged to them on the Purley's Reserve in northern Saskatchewan, for example. So it wasn't an explicitly racist legislation, but in practicality, in terms of accessing those benefits, that was different. I compared I think there's a rather clear line between the veteranhood and the service of Chinese and Japanese Canadian veterans and explicitly campaigning for redress later on in the case of Japanese Canadian veterans, but also just for greater, for political equity in the immediate post-war era. Again, that was proof of service. Because a lot of Indigenous veterans returned to reserves, you didn't have that same immediate impact, but in terms of cultivating a leadership group, again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, many of the post-war First Nations veterans were post-war First Nation political leaders were veterans, and we see that today. I'm thinking of one veteran in particular who described, he'd grown up, he was a residential school survivor. He's from northern Saskatchewan, and for him, the experience with serving was, as he put it, serving when he was the only Indigenous person in his unit, but realizing that he was as good as anybody else, thriving in the military. That confidence carried through to his post-service civilian life, not necessarily politically involved, although he was a political leader, but in terms of just business, educational success. So that was his service. Kind of was an inflection point, a transition, which acted as a sort of boost. Now, again, that's not unique only to Indigenous or Black veterans. I mean, I think of so many Second World War veterans that I talked to, and I interviewed 40 of them, who say, look, I had a grade 4 education. My life was going along this certain trajectory. As a result of the post-war Veterans Charter and skills I learned perhaps in service, I acquired these skills, and then my life went off in another way. One veteran of the Second World War, he he became a doctor. He was practiced until into his 90s. And that was a future that was not open to him until the Second World War, until the educational opportunities that were opened up as a result of that. So it is often an inflection point, this transition zone where one's life kind of veers off in a way that it might not have been heading before. And I mean, there are elements that are unique to Black and Indigenous veterans, but that's also a common theme for all veterans that we interviewed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Monsieur Perroux, les 6 prochaines minutes.
Mr. Petrou, the second vice chair of the committee, Mr. Luc Desilets, will be asking you questions for the next 6 minutes. So within the 200 interviews you did, how many were on Métis and Black veterans? Black people, I think there were 11 veterans. And Indigenous people, maybe 26. There were 2 Muslim veterans, 1 Arab, 1 from Asia. The interpreter would like to note that the witness is quite far away from the microphone.
Recall 26 Indigenous, 11 Black. We have veterans who were from South Asia, 1 Palestinian veteran. I'm best I can remember 5 or 6 Jewish veterans, 2 Muslim veterans, quite a few LGBTQ veterans, specifically I think 7 or 8 from the Purge. We tried to get the diversity, Francophones I'd have to count, but we tried to get we tried to reflect the diversity of Canada.
OK. Si on résume, merci pour...
Thank you for that precise data. So in sum, it's about 20% of Black, Indigenous, Métis veterans that you've met up with, more or less. In your opinion, this is an easy question, their treatment in the Army, was it the same as the treatment white people received?
Quote, in the Army than outside the Army, I think is what was told to me. And again, veterans that were Black and Indigenous spoke of discrimination inside the military, absolutely. But if I can generalize, I think the recollections as it was conveyed to me was that there was less racism and that they were more likely to be treated based on their own skills and merits than the color of their skin inside the military than outside.
Selon vous, le traitement que ces vétérans-là ont.
In your opinion, speaking of the Black, Métis, and Indigenous veterans, is their experience the same as veterans than white veterans?
I don't feel qualified to answer that. I'm sorry. I know you'd like a response. I can't recall when I cast my mind back on the 200 interviews. There have been complaints about treatment from Veterans Affairs, absolutely. To the best of my recollection right now, I can't recall any veteran who suggested that their treatment from Veterans Affairs, where it fell short, was as a result of their being Black or Indigenous or Métis or indeed their background. Now, perhaps I should highlight here the experiences of the LGBTQ veterans and the Purge, and there was legal struggles and efforts to obtain an apology, and I think that was obviously it's not Veterans Affairs with the government, and that was obviously related to identity. But when I cast my mind back to the Black and Indigenous veterans, I can't recall any suggestion or any accusation that where Veterans Affairs fell short, it was related to their indigeneity or their being Black.
Si je vous pose la question autrement.
I'll ask the questions from a different angle on the same topic. In your opinion,
Par le gouvernement.
Quoi?
Reconnu.
Are they recognized in any way?
I think we have, there's always work to be done, but I think we have we've highlighted, and we continue to highlight, certain undertold stories. We've recently made additions regarding black veterans or black soldiers in the First World War in our permanent galleries. I think there have been some broader efforts across Canadian society to recognize veterans that were not recognized, and I would extend that to women as well. I think that certainly we spoke to a number of Second World War veteran women who talked about kind of being forgotten and moving back into civilian life, not being welcomed at the Legion the same way the men were. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think Indigenous veterans are certainly especially recognized in their own communities, perhaps in a way that doesn't happen in non-Indigenous communities. So again, I think it's changing. I think the museum, I hope, is part of those efforts of trying to shine a light on some of these undertold stories. I think within their own communities, I'm thinking of Acaciaville in Nova Scotia, there's efforts amongst the long-standing black community there to recognize some of these undertold stories within their own communities. So it's certainly happening, again, within First Nations, within individual communities. And I think, and I hope, some of the larger national institutions, such as the War Museum, we're trying, we're doing our best, and I think we're taking steps.
Vous avez dit tantôt que les vétérans, notre 20% encore une fois.
Referring to the 20%, you mentioned something earlier.
10 à 25%, qu'importe.
So maybe 10 to 25% is the proportion. They said they were not welcomed into the legions back in the day. Is that still the case?
Formal case. I mentioned one again. It was the son. It was an Indigenous veteran and the son of a very highly decorated Indigenous veteran of the Second World War, who, again, speaking of this idea that you're enjoying a greater sense of equity inside the military, and then his words were, we're good enough to die beside, but we're not good enough to share a drink with in the Legion. But he wasn't speaking of a formal Legion policy. I think he was speaking of more social ostracism or exclusion. Some women, I should say, Second World War veteran women, did speak about challenges of accessing the Legion in the post-war years. Yeah.
Merci.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Invite Miss Rachel Blaney to take the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Perot, for being here today and being our sole witness and answering all of our questions. I think that, what your testimony has really caused me to contemplate and think about is that first of all, it's very hard to speak on behalf of other people. You've witnessed the stories, but you haven't the lived experience, and so I thank you for trying to reference those voices that you've heard and accept how hard it can be to actually make those voices clear when it's not your lived experience. So thank you for doing that. You talked about using service to belong, and about how even though they experienced racism in the military, often when they left the military, there was experiences of sort of reintegrating back into Canada and re-experiencing a level of discrimination that they weren't necessarily used to in the military. And I'm just wondering, because, you also talked about how they don't, not all, but a lot of them really want to be noticed for their service, but not noticed because they're an Indigenous person or Black person providing that service.
That's a couple individuals.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is that these things are really complex and, like you said earlier, really individual. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about when you listen to some of the testimony about belonging, and 26 and 11 isn't a big thing, is a huge group, so it's hard to make all of these assumptions about the whole in that way. But just, I'm really fascinated by that idea of using service to belong. And if you heard that from non-Indigenous, non-Black people talking about using the military to belong, can you tell us if there's any nuance in the difference there?
Well, I think in Canada, look, someone that is Black, for example, is more likely to, a Black child is more likely to face questions about some well-intentioned and some perhaps malevolent, where are you from? Where's your family really from? And I'm speaking of a couple of the black veterans whose family, came here after the American Revolution. A black individual in Canada, of course, is more likely to face those questions about where are you really from than someone who has lighter skin. I mean, I don't think that's a controversial opinion. So someone that's not black or not Indigenous or not brown is not going to have that same sort of pressure to prove that they belong here because it's assumed they belong based on the color of their skin. So I think that idea of using veteranhood or using service as a path to social acceptance, as a path to belonging, is unique to Indigenous and racialized veterans. Now, again, it's a path for social mobility for poor people. Everyone's life gets changed, sometimes for the better. I'm often cautious, and these interviews reveal, yes, trauma and some of those cascading impacts. But I also recall a veteran that said, she's a veteran of Afghanistan, a woman, she said, look, everyone expects because I'm a woman because I served in Afghanistan for me to say that war was hell, that we're broken, and she says, no, many of us are happy with what we did. So that inflection point, that shift can be a positive one. It can be a path for social mobility, and it is a path for social mobility and post-service workplace skills for veterans, regardless of their background. I think what I'm arguing and what I think is reflected in these interviews is that in terms of veteranhood or service as a pathway for acceptance as being Canadian, as belonging, despite looking different, that's unique to racialized veterans in a way that is not to white veterans. I think I'm comfortable saying that.
Well, thank you for that. I also just wanted to ask, you talked about speaking with 26 Indigenous veterans. I know that there's Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. Are you able to get back to us on what that is? I don't expect you to have it at the top of your head. Okay, if you do, then
as best I can. So 26. So you're right. In the 26 there, it might be one or two more. I'm including Métis veterans or their family members there. I'm not including. Unfortunately, I've not yet interviewed Inuk veterans. I don't believe I've interviewed anyway. There's gaps. The North is a gap that we're hoping to fill. So 26 First Nations and Métis so far, no Inuit.
Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful for me. It is interesting to me. You talked about reintegrating back into society and some of them experiencing discrimination in a more poignant way, let's say that. So one of the things that I found interesting about that is we've heard, especially from Indigenous veterans, that when they are accessing services from VAC, sometimes there are people that are not trained well who react to them with some very racist comments about things that are just completely inappropriate. So I'm just wondering, that sort of broad idea of that Canada can sometimes not be as friendly to people from these communities. Do you ever hear anything specifically about services that they're trying to access where they experience discrimination based on their First Nation or their Indigenous status or their Black status?
I mean, I don't question the testimonies of other witnesses, but that's not something that I encountered in my interviews. No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to have two more interventions of 5 minutes each, and I invite the first Vice President of the committee, Mr. Blake Richards.
Sure, thanks. First, I'd like to move this following motion that I put on notice on Monday. Given that during a recent Remembrance Day ceremony at Sir Robert Borden High School, the school played an anti-Israel protest song associated with the ongoing war in Gaza, instead of playing music associated with the service and sacrifice of Canadian service members. The principal of the school defended the choice, complaining that Remembrance Day is too often about, and I quote, a white guy who has done something related to the military. that the committee report to the House its opinion that the principal of Sir Robert Borden High School should be terminated for his actions. I just want, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the motion, as I do have some questions for our witness, but I would like to say, just in relation to it, when I go to speak at schools in my riding and elsewhere, one of the most important things that I do is I teach the children about how important, the students, about how important it is to honor and remember the service and the sacrifice that has given them the right to be there in school and learning, where some children in other parts of the world don't get those opportunities. And how important it is for them to remember that the very opportunity for all of us around this table to be here to serve and be representatives of the people in our communities is because of that service and that sacrifice. And I can't imagine anything more damaging to ensuring that that next generation remembers and understands that than for a school to dishonor Remembrance Day service, for a school to make anything other than the sacrifice and service of those veterans and those still serving be the theme and the importance of that day. There's nothing that's more dishonoring to that memory than to make it about something else, some kind of a protest or a political message or whatever it might be. It should only be focused on the service and sacrifice of those, and that's all that a service should be focused on. And so with that, I certainly hope that all members of this committee will be joining with me in condemning that terribly disgraceful kind of behavior, and in standing up for our veterans and in standing up for honoring the importance of remembrance. So I'll move that motion, and I hope we can vote on it quickly and get to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. So, Mr. Petro, it's in our procedure, so I have to give the floor to members of the committee. You can stay there. So, who would you like to intervene? Mr. Randip Sarai.
I haven't decided on how I'll go forward on this, but I will say it's highly inappropriate what happened there. It's a Remembrance Day. It's supposed to be about veterans and the sacrifices they've made. Although I just think the jurisdiction of it is a provincial or municipal matter or a school board matter, where I believe that's where it belongs. I don't think the appropriateness is necessarily in this state. We don't govern the principals. We have no sanctions on them. We have nothing that we could tell them what to do. But so I think it really falls in their purview. A school board should look into that, or the government that mandates school boards, which is the province, needs to do that. Although I will say it was inappropriate to do that. Protest for other means is not an appropriate mechanism on a day of remembrance for veterans.
Thank you, Mr. Sarai. So now, Ms. Blenay.
Well, I'm disappointed that we're taking up time that we could be dealing with a witness. He moved it in public. We could have just done that at a different time, but here we are. Remembrance Day is a really important day to remember people who served our country. It is a time of great sorrow for so many families across the country, and educating young people about what that looks like and the cost of war is something tremendously important. And I really don't condone that behavior that we saw there. I think it was, not well thought out. I think that complex discussions always need to happen, but that is not the time or place for complex. It's a time to honor people who served us. However, I won't be supporting this motion because I don't feel it is a role of a committee to make that kind of judgment. I believe that when hard things happen, communities and the areas need to deal with that, and that is their sacred right. And when we come and impose as a committee that isn't part of the community, it just seems a little bit odd. So I really hope that our voices obviously are all the same around the table, that what is heard is we don't believe that is appropriate behavior, but isn't our job to tell people how to, I think the motion says fire someone. That is not our role as a committee. So perhaps the member could think about what our role is, which might be to have an opinion, but not to tell people what the action should be.
Thank you, Ms. Blenay. And now let's go back to Mr. Richards.
And that is exactly what the motion does. It offers our opinion. And if it isn't our place to offer an opinion about how veterans have been disrespected and how if it's not our place to stand up and be counted to show that we are standing for our veterans, then whose place is it?
Maintenant, Monsieur Desilets, pour
On to Mr. Desilets. Mr. Chair, I agree with my other colleagues from the Conservative Party. I do appreciate treating this with delicacy. With delicacy. It was completely inappropriate, this event, but I do think that this happens to be under the purview of the provincial jurisdictions and has nothing to do with federal responsibilities. Let's let them take care of it. To see, I used to be a principal. I would think that it would be, I would have thought it was quite funny or even scandalous for a federal committee to involve itself in our affairs. Thank you, Mr. Desilets. So all parties were able to intervene. I will ask the clerk to take the votes on this motion tabled by Mr. Richards.
Mr. Chair, on Mr. Richards' motion, Mr. Casey?
Against.
Mr. Sarai?
Against.
Ms. Hefner? Contre. Mr. May?
I abstain.
Mr. Miao?
Against.
Mr. Richards?
I am for standing up for our veterans.
Mr. Dowdle? Sorry, Mr. Tomey?
I'm in favor.
Mr. Dowdle?
In favor.
Mrs. Wagenthal?
I abstain.
Monsieur Desilets?
Contre.
Ms. Blaney?
Against.
Merci. Bon, alors, la motion déposée par Monsieur Richards a été défaite, 3 contre 6. Donc, nous revenons donc avec Monsieur.
The motion was defeated 3 against 6. So back to Mr. Petru and the questions. So, Mr. Richards, you have 3 minutes to pursue your questions.
I've got about 4 questions, and as it was mentioned, about 5 minutes to do them. So I'll ask that you try to keep the responses, 30 seconds or less, I suppose. So the first question I had for you is, we've heard a little bit, including from you today, about Indigenous veterans who were denied benefits when they returned home after World War I, World War II, and I think Korea as well. Would you say that they were set back compared to their fellow veterans who did receive greater benefits?
I don't want to be cautious about saying denied. Again, there wasn't legislation preventing them from access in it. This was more a result of circumstance, returning to reserves, not having access as opposed to being denied.
Okay, fair enough. But would you still say it would have set them back as compared to fellow veterans?
I could speculate, but I think we all could speculate that having less access to certain education, buying land, yes, but I can't assert that with conviction or examples to back it up.
That's fair. Would you say that for veterans returning to Canada after those wars, would you say that economic stability here at home in Canada would have played a role in ensuring a successful transition to civilian life after the wars?
Perhaps, and I think that all Canadians enjoyed a post-war economic boom. Again, to go back to the conversation with Mr. Dowdle, is the greater help that the veterans of the Second World War had as they came back to a country where 1.1 million Canadians had served. Those who didn't serve understood what they had gone through. There wasn't that isolation that there is for younger veterans of Afghanistan. I think that, and it's still hard. Like 99-year-old veterans I've spoken to have talked about PTSD using different vocabulary, but I recognize what they're saying. But they weren't isolated. They were surrounded by people that understood what they did, that often had taken part in those efforts. The experience for veterans today is, I think, very different because they're not surrounded by people that were part of that same effort. I think that dislocation is more profound, and perhaps being surrounded by people that understood them was even more helpful in the post-Second World War era than the economic stability that they were enjoying, as we all were.
Okay. And certainly there's no question that having supports is important. I mean, would you also say, though, that the idea that having access to timeliness in terms of getting those benefits is important in that transition to life after service?
Yeah, again, with the cautious that I don't feel entirely comfortable diving into the nuts and bolts of policy. I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say, but I say that with a lot of caveats that I'm not a policy person, and I mean, what you say makes, of course, sense, but I wouldn't go farther than that.
Okay, fair enough. That may answer the last question I have, but would you say that not having access to timely benefits, would you say that the fact that we've got a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis in Canada would contribute to veterans struggling to make that transition to civilian life?
Again, I'd be speculating. Like, I think I understand where you're going, and this is getting more into policy and perhaps politics, which is not, I don't really feel is something that I feel qualified to speak to.
Okay, that's fair.
With apologies.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
D'accord. Merci, Monsieur Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. We have spent the first hour with you, Mr. Petru. I have 5 minutes too, do I not? You can't give our 5 minutes to the we can't give our 5 minutes to the Conservatives and not give them to me. I understand, but the time of discussion on the motion means that it impeded on some of our time, and we do have other witnesses to welcome. So he had 3 minutes instead of 5 minutes, and so that we would be able to welcome our other panel. Well, I had questions for this witness. Ms. Blaney?
I'm just wondering if we could extend the meeting by a few minutes to accommodate all the needs.
So we are agreed to allow the 3 minutes to. Okay, so. Yeah, Ms. Hefner. Okay, you have 3 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Here, Mr. Petru. I wanted to ask you this question because I also spent more than 20 years as a daily journalist. I feel it's a career that never really leaves you. It becomes part of your intrinsic being. I know that as a parliamentarian now, I use everything I learned as a journalist, all the skills that I gained over the years to inform my work here. Would you please tell us more about your history as a war correspondent and how that is informing the work you're doing now with the museum?
Good question. So yeah, I did spend many years as a foreign correspondent. I have covered conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East and elsewhere. I think some veterans are aware of that. I don't usually mention it, so I think most are not. Journalists and soldiers are in war zones for fundamentally different reasons. I think that's important. Perhaps some of the people I've interviewed, I knew from Afghanistan. There are certain elements of being a journalist in a war zone that are similar. For better or for worse, I do know what it's like to be shot at. I do know what it's like to lose colleagues. Those might be similarities, but ultimately we are in conflict zones for different reasons. When I've been under fire, I curl up in a fetal position in the bottom of a trench, and I think that's perfectly understandable for journalists. I think soldiers have different reactions. So I think I would reluctantly say that perhaps it's given me a limited insight into some of the experiences that veterans have had, but I'd say it's very limited. Perhaps being a journalist and simply along a history of talking to people, and perhaps more importantly knowing when to be quiet, has been useful in this exercise, which I should say, if you'll permit me, has been enormously rewarding, and I feel very lucky to have had the conversations that I've had, perhaps especially with the Second World War veterans who were sadly losing, but the entire experience has been an enriching one, and I'm grateful for it.
I think that's exactly the point. Knowing how to listen and how to talk to people, I think, is a key part of journalism that we can bring to other careers. This, in their own voices, can you tell us what you hope comes out of this, and tell us more about how it affected the veterans to be able to have a platform to share their stories?
I think it's been difficult for some veterans to have these conversations. They've been painful. There's been a lot of tears. There's been a few hugs. The purpose was never to be validating. It was to explore, but I think it has been a positive experience for some veterans. I think it's been very difficult for others. These are heavy, difficult conversations. But I hope, my dear hope is that veterans who do not participate in the project will hear their own stories and their own experiences reflected in the voices of the veterans that we did interview and that are part of the exhibition, and that I hope other Canadians, family members, non-veterans, through this exhibition will perhaps have a deeper understanding of what people they may know or veterans in general, what their experiences are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Donc, c'est ce que je disais, Monsieur Michael Petit.
As we want to thank you for your presence here today. If you have anything else you'd like to add, please send it to the clerk. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to suspend a few minutes to welcome the other witnesses for the next session.
Alors,
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are resuming today's session.
witnesses with us for this second hour. So I'd like to say welcome to them. And as witnesses, we have from Legacy Voices, Mrs. Katie Grant. She's an historian, Black Canadian Veterans Voices. And from Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, we have Mervyn Bouvier, Minister of Veterans Affairs, and John Bélanger, Veterans. So I welcome all of you, and you're going to have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and after that, we're going to ask you some questions to go further. So I invite you, Mrs. Grant, to start for 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to read this. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to your deliberations. My name is Kathy Grant, founder of the Legacy Voices Project, co-creator of the Black Canadian Veterans Stories program and website, historian on number 2 Construction Battalion Commemoration Committee, and school and community educator on the struggles and accomplishments of the many Black Canadians who have served our country in military service since the War of 1812.
Excuse me, Ms. Grant, can you move a little bit closer to the microphone, please? Thank you.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
My father was a veteran of the Canadian Army and Air Force. He was an immigrant from Barbados. He specifically chose to come to Canada to join in the effort to defeat our enemies in World War II. After an extensive career in public service, my father turned his attention to gaining and sharing a better understanding of the contributions of Black participants in the war effort. Before his death, he asked me to continue those efforts, and I've done that, and I continue to do it. Others have contributed mightily to my research. Extensive work by the late Tamus Gale and his very large collection of research has been foundational. Efforts by many veterans to share their stories and their understanding with me have proved invaluable. Family members of veterans have added to my research and my understanding. The collaboration of professional educators, military reserve personnel, multimedia journalists, student research assistants, Library and Archives Canada, and the Canadian War Museum have greatly enriched my work. Of course, the work of your committee is focused on the contemporary experience of our veterans and how you might contribute to improving their experience. What I want to tell you is that the past, our history, shapes the present. And if we understand the past accurately and the present times fully, we are better able to shape the future. 110 years ago, Many Black Canadians and some others from the United States and the Caribbean devoutly wished to join the Canadian military in World War I. Some were successful in doing so, but many were refused enlistment for no other reason than their race. After 2 years of advocacy by Black clergymen and community leaders, and many obstacles and obstructions, No. 2 Construction Battalion began to take shape, an all-Black unit with white officers other than a Black honorary captain, the chaplain, eventually sending about 600 members to Europe in non-combatant support roles in forestry and construction. These efforts were no doubt important to the war effort, but there's no question that finding military roles for an entirely Black unit without providing them with weapons was somewhat founded on unreasonable ignorance and racism, and also the numbers just weren't there. Nonetheless, No. 2 Construction Unit served Canada well and contributed to our eventual victory. After much pressure from the Black community, primarily in Toronto and area, a plaque was installed at Queen's Park in Ontario, and very little was heard about No. 2 for decades, almost a century. As World War II commenced, like many other Canadians and Commonwealth citizens, Black people, men and women, sought to join in military efforts to defeat the Nazis. At the time, and until 1942, the RCF did not permit the enlistment of Black people. They said that you had to be of pure European descent. The Canadian Navy had a policy of exclusion. They said you had to be of the white race to get in, and only a handful of Black sailors were accepted. Only 5 out of the entire Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War, and only one of them was able to go overseas. Eventually, the RCF relented, and a number of Black enlistees distinguished myself, including my father. You can read some of these stories on our website, Black Canadian Veterans Stories, blackcanadianveterans.com, or on our Facebook page of the same name. We also have a new website that we launched on No. 2 Construction Battalion on the 7th of November. Since World War II, the contributions of Black Canadians to our military have continued and grown. Infantry, divers, medics, pilots, logistics experts, engineers, administrators, technicians, mechanics, transport, in fact, every aspect of our Army, Navy, and Air Force. Unfortunately, many Canadians are less aware of the significant contributions in history and in the present of Black Canadians in our military service. Only very recently have some schools begun to include this information in the classroom. Accurate and thorough information is not widely available. Along with our fellow colleagues and professional friends, we are attempting to change this for the better. After many somewhat forgotten or ignored parts of history, misinformation, outright mistruths, and limited research with little financial and moral support continue to limit our understanding. Many of our institutions and agencies, lacking knowledge themselves, have contributed unknowingly to the poor quality of public information and understanding of the significant contributions of Black military personnel. And real understanding breeds collaboration, cooperation, and better results. Contemporary Black veterans have told me that they do not always receive respectful, timely, and helpful services from Veterans Affairs. Their friendships, inevitable conversations, and service quality comparisons with fellow veterans of other racial backgrounds have helped them understand that this is not a broadly based problem in all Veteran Affairs interactions with their clients generally, but rather something that seems to impact the Black veterans more commonly? Does this have anything to do with a generally poor understanding of the historical and recent past contributions of Black military personnel? It may very well. How do we move forward? How do we move forward toward real acknowledgement of the contributions of all members, past and present, of our military services? As a historian and educator, I will offer what I know. We must better educate our school children and the general public, and to do that, we need to expand upon the current base of mostly volunteer work, uncovering and promoting the history, the accurate and complete history of Black Canadians in the military. We must also encourage the gaining of this knowledge within the Veterans Affairs staff. Respect, attentiveness, and comparison are based, at least in part, on knowledge. And I'll just wrap up here. On a closing note, I must tell you that in Toronto and in my travels doing this work, I see Army, Navy, and Air Cadets. I see more of them, girls and boys of diverse racial backgrounds, many more. We have a recruitment challenge in our armed forces. Many of these cadets may, in the near future, be part of the solution. Let us prepare with real knowledge and understanding so that they might be encouraged to join professionally, sure that they will enjoy the personal and professional respect we ought to offer both in service and one day as veterans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Cathy Grant, for your opening remarks. And now let's move to Mr. Bélanger for 5 minutes. Please, go ahead, Mr. John Bélanger.
Good morning. First of all, just let you know that I myself am a proud son of my late father, Leo, who landed on the Juno beaches during the Second World War. I have an older brother that served 30 years, and I myself did 27 years in the service. So I'm here representing the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, official representative of Section 35 rights holders in Saskatchewan. We are a government that operates for and by Métis citizens, dedicating and preserving and advancing the rights, identity, and well-being of Métis people. Currently working to negotiate a modern-day treaty with the Government of Canada to advance the interests of our citizens, including the brave veterans and their families. As a veterans representative for the MNS, I speak regarding the things that matters to the Métis veterans. While it's important that Métis veterans are predominantly the same as First Nation and Inuit veterans, some of these things are just sharing stories, supporting the veterans and their families, support the transitioning, recognition of which there is a distinct key. Indigenous people have always been left out of the history, and the stories are being told. A prime example is how a few people know about the critical role of the code talkers. Media have also had this plight, but to the degree that society and history has often taken a pan-Indigenous approach in sharing the histories and achievements of our peoples, because we did fight alongside the First Nation cousins. Distinction is ensuring our Métis pride and visible. To end, some of the key priorities in Saskatchewan are to identify veterans in Saskatchewan, build connections with them, and help them connect with each other, beginning to document, collect their distinct stories and experiences. I know myself, when we talk about anything to do with veterans, there is a cut-off when it comes to coming from remote parts of Canada. A huge disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bouvier, you don't want to intervene, so no, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. I just want to just alliterate culture and language. A lot of times, culture and language is not educated enough to modern society. Where I come from, a lot of veterans came home, and a lot of times they didn't understand, the culture that's been. They understand the culture, but modern people didn't understand the culture of how to present themselves to the culture people, and especially when it came to language or living, how they live with their culture themselves. So education is very important. So what happened was mental health was a big issue. They forgot about that mental health, that it passed on from families, from the veteran itself to their families. And today it still exists. Where I come from the north, I lived with veterans all my life, but most of them have gone, but people still survive from the veteran side. So they need a lot of support in the mental health support. And I think we're trying to establish a booklet now to revise all the veterans that come from the Métis side and the First Nation. So we're creating a partnership to create a booklet. But we don't have enough funds, so we need the federal government to step up and help us out with the federal funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bouvier. And now we're going to start the first round of questions. It's going to be 6 minutes each. And I invite, Mrs. Wagenthal for 6 minutes. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to interact with you. And Kathy? Yes. Is that all right? Call you Kathy. I have a little quote here that I brought forward, and you really struck a chord with me on this. It's from 1870 to 1953 from Hilaire Belloc, was his lifetime. And he said, "To comprehend the history of a thing is to unlock the mysteries of its present, and more to discover the profundities of its future." In other words, we don't study history only to know what happened then. We study history to understand what's happening now and, of course, where it's going to go in the future. I really appreciated what you shared with us. And you talked specifically of the present and how you are seeing more Black young people engaged. With the cadet program as an example, and that program is very precious to me. What ideas do you have as far as encouraging more Black young people to engage in the cadet program?
It's not only, I guess, only Black. It's like everybody. All
agreed.
But we find that when we show examples and pictures and images of our stories, and we encourage them to go and visit our website, they're amazed to see how much history is there.
Right.
I know that yesterday or a couple of days ago, we had 100 students come up from Ottawa, and we were able to go and share the stories, and they were amazed to know how much of a rich history we have.
Well, thank you so much for that work, and I do hope that it brings about good results. I would like to ask, actually, first of all, welcome from Saskatchewan. It's so good to have you here, my home province, and I've been on this committee since 2017. In 2018, this committee at that time traveled up to northern Saskatchewan, to Beauval. Now, I don't know if you consider that north when you look at the province, but it is to us, and also to Yellowknife, and had the opportunity to engage a lot more with Indigenous veterans. And I just want to take a moment to say Vimy Ridge would not have happened the way it did for Canada without the incredible mapping abilities and commitment of our First Nations, Inuit and Métis, to that whole exercise. Instead of losing 100,000 soldiers, as France and England did, we were able to have victory there. And I thank you and your past for that contribution. You mentioned about some of the frustrations that are still there from the past. And I know with World War II, promises were made that were not kept. Would you like to just speak briefly on that? And then I have a quote I would like to have you respond to as well on that.
Well, I will tell you, I do have a stepmother at home that we lived with us since I was a young man, a baby, 1 year old. Unfortunately, my dad went to the Second World War, and when he came home, he was a bush pilot, and he had an accident. And I lost my mother. I never knew her, but because I was just a young fella. But this lady I'm speaking to now is alive and well. She took care of us since we were young, and there was lots of issues when you think about it on my father's side. Like, we talk about PTSD all the time, and I stand here and tell you, I know he had PTSD, but he'd never admit to it. You know, because back then we lived so remote. I say remote. I'm north of Bow Valley, not very far north, but there's nothing there. Back then, you know, we had one highway, and half the time they walked.
I was going to say, actually, I have comments from someone who knew Louis Roy. I don't know if you know who that is, who was a World War II veteran. And he basically told her they walked for 3 days to get to Meadow Lake to be able to enlist.
Were you at Louis Roy's retirement a few years ago when he gave him that contribution, his payments for his Second World War?
I don't believe that I was there for that. We were able to see that they had built a monument of sorts there to remember their service. But I did meet him, and he's a remarkable man. His story is real, though, and this is the thing. This is, I think, one that is passed down. My friend Marge Matchie met him that day, and I think this story should be included in those stories that you have mentioned. But, you know, they came back, right, and were promised land, and that did not come to be, didn't come to pass. And when I talk about history, that was in the past, and this has been discussed that it needs to be dealt with, and it still hasn't been dealt with. You know, I know that a lot of them are no longer here anymore, but they certainly, their families are still here. So there is a submission in the Conservative Convention policy manual that indicates that that needs to be dealt with, and I do hope we're able to do that.
Well, I didn't quite finish what I was going to tell you guys.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, I'm going to say 30 years ago, when I spoke to my father, I came back to Saskatchewan while I was still in the service, and I think the federal government offered him a compensation program of $10,000. This was quite a while ago. And my dad said, yes, I'll take it. But it went up to him. You know, he just said, he just wanted of many people that, and he ended up didn't get it. And he told me, he said, I will never see that money, he told me. And I told him, I'll spend it for you, is what I told him. But of course, they granted that to my stepmother, which is great. But he said, it's going to take too long to get payments, is what he told me. It's just too much red tape. And it did. I think it was almost 20 years till after he passed that he got something for it. For something after he passed. And it's done.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bélanger. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to invite Mr. Brian May for 6 minutes, please. Mr. May.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be directing my questions to you, Ms. Grant, today. First of all, thank you for being here. One of the reasons I moved this motion to do this study was I had the honor and privilege to represent the Minister of Defense last year, almost a year and a half ago now, in Pictou for the commemoration and the remembrance ceremonies for the No. 2 Battalion. And I learned about the history, and I met a number of advocates and historians that shared the stories. And I agree with you. I think this comes down to education. I think it comes down to commemoration and filling that gap that exists currently. And I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to the efforts. I know Minister Petitpat Taylor launched a call for organizations to apply. I think the initial rollout was about 370,000, and I think as early as November 7th, or as recently as November 7th, an additional $500,000 is available for organizations to apply for programming that can really focus on that aspect of education. And I'm wondering if you know of any of the organizations that would be applying or have maybe applied, and what might come of that.
Okay, well, I know that I think that last year, I think it's like 225,000 was last year and 500,000 is for this year. So for the 225,000, each group or organization was able to apply for up to 25,000 to go in. So we actually applied. We got 25,000. We launched our website on number 2 Construction Battalion on the 7th. We partnered with York Region District School Board. We partnered with veterans to go and produce it. So I'm encouraging everyone to go and visit it. And there are a number of groups that applied. There's a group in British Columbia that applied. One of the members, her name is Dora Gibson. She's a retired captain. I was a historian on the number 2 Construction Battalion apology, and we worked with Library and Archives Canada to ensure that the records were digitized. So the records are all digitized and are available online prior to the apology. And just yesterday, they announced that it was made a UNESCO History of the World, so teachers can go and get primary sources to go and share with their children.
Well, congratulations on that. That is an exceptional accomplishment. And I will also add, for anybody who is paying attention and watching these proceedings, I believe it's the end of January of 2025. Applicants are still available. Applications are still able to go in for that 500,000.
Yeah, the students, it's like up to 50,000. So a group of students from Ottawa came up a couple of days ago, and we encouraged them. We said that you're a school, you're provincial, so you can apply to 50,000. And other, I think it was like the Catholic Board. So the York Region in Toronto said that they will be willing to go and work with other schools. So we're encouraging schools to apply, and we're happy to work with them.
Excellent. In a bit of a different event, I understand that you were invited by the French Embassy to in Ottawa to attend the 95th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and I'm wondering if maybe you can share with us your experience and your takeaways from that.
Okay, so we went there, and what many people were not aware of was someone by the name of Curly Christian. And Curly Christian lost all 4 of his limbs at the Battle of Vimy Ridge and survived. And we happened to have his scrapbook from when he went over to Vimy with us, and we donated it to the Canadian War Museum. And we also found out that his granddaughter, Anne Christian, actually lives in Ottawa. So it was a great opportunity to go and share that story, because many people are not aware of the only person who lost all 4 of his limbs at Vimy Ridge and survived was here. Even the Commonwealth as well, so it's both Canada and the Commonwealth.
Can you speak a little bit more about the opportunity to work with the War Museum? I know that the 100th anniversary of the number 2 battalion was in 2016, and they're working on. We just had a gentleman from the War Museum here. I'm wondering if maybe there's more you can expand on that.
Okay, so for the 100th anniversary of number 2 Construction Battalion, we had a display at the Canadian War Museum. You can actually look it up on CBC. And we were able to go and get descendants to go and share their stories. I know that there's a quilt at the War Museum currently that has the members there. So we were actually, last week, we were there with Silver Cross Mother Agatha Dyer, and she's there helping us as well in terms of promoting the story.
Excellent. I'm not sure if I have time for a question and answer, so I'll just simply say thank you for being here and for the continued work that you're doing to recognize the battalion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brian May. Et maintenant, nous allons passer au deux.
Now, on to the second vice chair of the committee, Mr. Luc Desilets, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our 3 witnesses for being here. There's something very touching in the stories you've told, Mr. Bélanger and Ms. Grant. Bélanger sounds very much from Quebec, by the way. Ms. Grant in particular, and Mr. Bélanger, if you've followed in the footsteps of your parents, and I find that very touching. I think it's beautiful that you're able to continue their story and really relate to that. I find it very touching. Ms. Grant, I do have a question for you. Why was your father, in your opinion, why did he have this profound desire or need to do some research on the history of Black veterans? Where do you think that came from?
Okay. So my father came up from Barbados to volunteer to fight for Canada in the Second World War. He was in both the Canadian Army as well as the Canadian Air Force. Before he passed away in 2005, he said, "Kathy, I want you to continue my legacy of telling the stories of our Black veterans." And he also told someone by the name of Sarah Anyango to do the same thing. So I met her at my dad's funeral, and it's 20 years, and we keep telling the stories, whether it's engaging Department of Defense or Veterans Affairs, to continue the stories. So it's a promise I made to my dad, and I'm going to keep doing it, and my children are going to keep doing it as well.
Bravo. Selon vous, là, l'histoire...
Bravo. In your opinion, is the history of Black and Indigenous Métis veterans sufficiently documented?
On recommence.
We'll start over. So you can cut my time, Mr. Chair. So I will start over. In your opinion, in 2024, do you feel that the history of Black veterans and military personnel is properly documented?
Okay. Some people document it well. I know that for number 2 Construction Battalion, I would say greater than 70% of the information that's out there and published contains misinformation. There are very few people who actually have knowledge in that area, and I find a lot of times that they're not the ones that are being consulted. There's a very few group of people who actually have that knowledge. I find that a lot of people are copying and pasting information. They do not have the knowledge. Like many people don't. People are saying they defuse landmines, they remove men from the battlefield. There's many images that are out there that are American soldiers that are not Canadian soldiers. That is done by both the media as well as schools as well. We're trying to correct that. And it's an ongoing process. And I know that with our new website, we're actually going to be having a myths and misinformation page to showcase the information accurately.
Vous faites beaucoup, mais selon vous...
You're doing a lot, but whose responsibility do you think it is to, go into history in order to highlight the work of Black veterans? Do you think it's private organizations, community organizations, Black organizations? Whose responsibility is it?
I would say it's everyone's responsibility to go and do it. I know through our group, Legacy Voices, we work directly with schools, and we encourage schools to go and share that information with other schools. Last year, there was a school, I think like the Oscar Peterson School, like their teacher, he was Italian, and we shared the information with him, and he got the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching from work with number 2 Construction Battalion information. We went to Library and Archives Canada and were able to go and share their information with their students, and their students were able to create websites for each individual soldier that they research. So I think it's everyone's responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. And I think if we just keep telling, like, learn one story and then share it, I think more people will know about it. Thank you.
Bravo pour ce prix. Vous avez utilisé...
Congratulations on that prize. You used an expression that I've had difficulty understanding. You talked about unreasonable racism. What did you mean by that?
Okay. If you take a look at the records at Library and Archives Canada, you will see multiple examples. So one example is when they were recruiting a person in Manitoba. He was a medical student. His name was Euban Greenidge. And when he went to go and get examined, the military doctor said, to the civilian doctor, I'm glad that you are examining the nigger. And those words are right there at Library and Archives Canada. There are multiple examples in Library and Archives Canada. Some of the language you really can't present in schools. A lot of times you have to shade it out. And those are some examples. There's at least 10 or 15 examples. Also, when they went to be recruited in Toronto and they asked, could you get one, would you be willing to accept a platoon? And there was not a single group that said that they would accept a platoon into their platoon. And they went to about 75 of them. So those records are actually at Library and Archives Canada. They've already been digitized. And some would say, well, they draw we're a kilted regiment, and we draw the line with when it comes to getting black soldiers, or if black soldiers would come in, it will prevent black soldiers from, or white soldiers, or the proper soldiers from getting in. So those are some of the examples of racism that we saw, but I know that members of the black community, they wanted to serve, and they were able to get in since the beginning. It's just the restrictions from the commanding officers that said no. But we do have some that went to EAPS and VIMI and whatever, so we have examples. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur Desilets. So now let's go.
Thank you, Mr. Desilets.
For 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. The testimony is so interesting to me, but I want to say thank you, Mr. Belanger, for your service. And I want to thank you, Ms. Grant, for carrying on your father's legacy. I really appreciate that commitment and the generational commitment that you've made here. So I'm going to come to you first, Ms. Grant. We did have an Indigenous veteran come to our committee early on in the study who spoke about having a space that is just for Indigenous veterans to come together to talk about their experiences and to share and have VAC participate to learn more about what's happening within that community in terms of everything, the history and what the veterans are actually experiencing. I'm wondering if you think that that would make sense for the Black veteran community as well, to have sort of a space where they could come together, share together, talk together, and if that could sort of learn from that how to better provide service. And I think after what you just testified around clarifying history and correcting it when other sources are putting incorrect information, that could be part of that as well.
Okay, I know that for like last year, Veterans Affairs had an opportunity where they were getting, I guess, the testimonies, they called it, I guess, like the BIPOC group. I hate that word. And then they had, I guess, they lumped together like the Black veterans and the brown veterans. And no, they have their own separate story to tell. So Veterans Affairs Canada actually went out and had different sessions where they would have the members of the Black veterans community go and talk and share what their experience was with Veterans Affairs. So I think that's a very positive step. It's just recent. I haven't read any of the reports that came out of that, but many of the Black veterans that we spoke to said that they were very appreciative of that. They found that when they went to sometimes to Veterans Affairs, they found that sometimes they were not taken seriously. And I think that there's hope, there's promise that's going to be happening going forward. But I think by them sharing their stories and their experiences, things will change because they'll say what they need to make things better for them.
And so something that's a little more regular maybe would be even more helpful to continue to bring those groups together and have different people participate would just really educate VAC to what those realities are.
I think they know what their experience are, and they don't want anybody else to go and tell their story because it belongs to them. This is their experience.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mr. Belanger, I want to come back to you. You talked about the remote nature of a lot of the communities, and we've heard this especially from a lot of Indigenous communities, is that because they're so far away, it can be challenging to access service. And Mr. Bovair, you talked about having culturally appropriate supports and services for people who are coming back. So if I could ask the both of you to talk about the challenges of belonging in remote communities and accessing services and what would be culturally appropriate.
Well, I refer back to the young lady that asked me where she came up to Beauval, and back then Louis Roy had to walk 3 days just to enlist. Well, it's a long way off the grid where I'm talking. Not off the grid. There's highways all the way there now. We don't. The Legion utilizes is utilized by Veteran Affairs to bring information forward. We don't have a Legion. The closest Legion for us is 2.5 hours away, so we can't access. It's difficult. We would need somebody to go to as an example, because right now, even me, I can't go to a Legion and I have to drive there. It's 2.5 hours to get there, and if they don't have the information to Veteran Affairs, it takes a long time. It was a huge disconnect when I got out of the service. I got hurt in the service, and Veteran Affairs, I did my thing to Veteran Affairs, and because of where I was living at the time, there was huge issues with getting services that I needed.
So, Mervyn, I know you talked a little bit about the language and trying to get some of those things back together and around providing supports that are culturally and language appropriate. I'm just wondering if you could talk about what those gaps are and what you're trying to do to address that.
So the language barrier is, and the cultural barrier sometimes affects a lot of our people that live in our communities. And we live in about 18 communities in the northwest side, and a lot of times people don't know the cultural side of people, of how they are. They have a different way of presenting themselves, and the cultural component and the language. The code talkers were the ones that saved the war in the World War II, I think, when Germany was fighting against. When they had World War II, so it didn't come back. That language didn't come back for us to find our identity. Instead, it was the modern society kept going and not giving us that way of understanding our own language. But some of us continued on, and we have that barrier. The main thing is we just have to have workshops and services and programs within our culture and within our language, and make people understand that that's where the barrier is a lot of times, because of distributing programs. We don't have nothing in the cultural component, so it's always on a modern component. So we need to make sure that it's delivered in a cultural and modern, so that we both understand each other and come to the table at the same level.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. And now we're going to have two interventions of 4 minutes each. And I invite my friend Fraser Tolmie for 4 minutes, please.
I'm glad you're my friend. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Ms. Grant, thank you for listening to your father and respecting and sharing and being able to remember the past and to honor him, and to our guests that have served, thank you for your service. And I know my colleague Ms. Wagenthal mentioned about Saskatchewan, being from Moose Jaw. It's great that we kind of outnumber Ontario here, so we're grateful for your presence, and that's why we're mentioning it. So that Ms. Grant, one of the things that I've known, my uncle was from Jamaica, and so it just, when I was growing up, for me, black and white, it was my family, but it wasn't until you experience some of the comments that are made outside, people, it's somewhat disgusting in my opinion, and so I'm grateful that you're here to be able to share, because one of the things that we as Canadians have prided ourselves on was the Underground Railway. And And what you're sharing with us today in your testimony is that we may have prided ourselves in the Underground Railway, but afterwards there's some work to be done. And I'd like to kind of touch a little bit on what you were sharing with regards to the American media and what you were saying about how the portrayal of blacks in the Canadian military isn't exactly what it is, you know, in our own hearts and in our own minds, and what you're doing to combat that and to actually expose what really has happened.
Okay, so what I want to clarify is that they're using American images of black soldiers in Canadian media, in Canadian publications. So it's not the Americans, it's Canadians getting the information incorrect. So no matter how many times we say, don't use this image, yes, we will not use this image. And sure enough, even on Remembrance Day, they had CBC have an image of those same 3 black Americans and had them labeled as number 2 Construction Battalion. Like it needs to change. I think there needs to be like a site that says don't use these images in order for it to be. And I know that in talking, I'm really happy to meet them from Saskatchewan, because the oldest black veteran, World War II veteran, was born in a place called Tisdale, Saskatchewan, and his name is Al V. Burden. I think he lives in Vernon, BC, and he's going to be turning 103 years old in January. And he got funding from, I think, like some liquid, I think, was poured on him, and I think they got like $20,000. It was kind of like a gas or whatever, so he was able to benefit from that.
Thank you for your answer. So my question then is so Canadians are using American media, I mean our own CBC. What about what does that say about us not using our own historical pictures, documents? Is that a form of neglect?
I would say that the documents are mislabeled. So sometimes they may not get the memo that it has changed. I know whether it's from Library and Archives Canada, the Canadian War Museum, whatever, they had mislabeled images from maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and they've removed them, and they have the correct labeling, but some people still have the wrong information. So I think it is just making sure that it gets communicated to educators, and that's what we're doing with schools. Say, if you see this image, don't use it.
Okay. One of the things that you touched on, and you know, I've served in the military, but I also was an Air Cadet, and I loved the cadet program. It was a fantastic program, and I have seen cadets of different cultures, different backgrounds, which means it's a very open organization, and it is a recruitment tool. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are with this government now, you know, reducing the budget for cadet programs.
I can't comment on that. What I can comment on was a person by the name of Dr. Stephen Blizzard, who worked very closely with the cadets. And I think that just working with the cadets and just having them, I guess, like share their stories. Everyone wants to, I find they're very respectful, like, no matter what color they are. And they're just open. There's an openness and a willingness, and even on Remembrance Day, when we had Agatha Dyer, the Silver Cross mother, there was a cadet that came up to her and wanted to know more about the story. So it's sharing the story. I think that the cadets themselves, whether the money is reduced or not, I think that they have that drive that it will continue.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to welcome one of our colleagues, Mr. Matthew Green, in replacement of Ms. Blaney. Welcome. And last 4 minutes to Mr. Sean Casey. Please, Mr. Casey, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Belanger, for your service. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Belanger. I know that your organization recently had a commemoration for National Indigenous Veterans Day. Can you talk a bit about the ceremony and how your community marks that day?
Well, what happens in our community during, you're talking about the 8th November, right?
Yes.
Well, our community schools in our community hold a Veterans Day, not parade, a gathering for all the students, and we have 2 schools now across the H hold one on that day. And when you go there, all the young ones start kindergarten up at the elementary school know what Remembrance Day is, and you go to the high school, of course, you're going to know what Remembrance Day. It is a huge thing. And then on the actual day of remembrance, on the 11th, we do have our community gets together and does their march and the prayers and everything at the cenotaph that's in the middle of our community.
I noted on your website that the ceremony is private for families and supporters. Is that in fact the case?
No.
Okay.
We will invite anyone that comes out. We encourage people to come out. I will tell you that in our community of Isle Lacrosse, the surrounding communities do come to it because of the lack of participation within their own communities. So it makes us very happy to have them come into our community.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm looking at the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. And what struck me was the reference to a private ceremony for Métis veterans and their families on Indigenous Veterans Day, but it was what struck me was that the private ceremony was live streamed. Mr. Bouvier, please.
So I think what you're talking about is Batoche.
Right.
We had a ceremony there on November 8th, and we had Army veterans, RCMP, from surrounding areas there, Duck Lake, just come together because it was an Aboriginal ceremony to support us, and so that's what that Batoche was, just to support the Aboriginal, Métis, and First Nations veterans.
Okay. Thank you for that. Ms. Grant, I was interested in your comments around Black veterans' interactions with Veterans Affairs Canada, and the comment, if I heard it correctly, that in conversations that Black veterans have with other communities, it's apparent to them that they're treated differently. So I guess first of all, have I fairly characterized what you said? And I just wonder if you can speak a bit more to that and what you would suggest to Veterans Affairs Canada to make it better.
Okay. There were the few Black veterans that I spoke to. I wouldn't say that it's across the board. I think that they were very pleased to be able to have their voices heard as a result of what Veterans Affairs Canada did to modify their taking of the information. They have explained that they find that it is easier. They said when they're speaking with someone who might be a member of the Black community as opposed to someone who is not, there's a better rapport because they better understand the community, they better understand the culture. So that might be something to be promoted, to make sure that when they call in, that there's someone who might be from their community that better understands. So that could not just be for the Black community, maybe the Indigenous community, they might be have a better rapport or a better understanding of certain things or certain language. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kessie. So we're going to stop right.
Point of order?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do apologize for coming late, but given some of the reflection of the testimony, I wonder if through you might extend to the witnesses the opportunity that if there are other veterans who have, for the good and welfare of this study, testimony that they want to provide in writing for the consideration of the final report, that other members who might not have been granted the opportunity to come could provide their remarks in writing for the benefit of the report.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I can tell you also that our clerk is doing extensive work to get in touch with different witnesses to have more information for our study like we did for women veterans. So now I'd like to say really thank you to the witnesses on behalf of the committee and myself. And I start with you, Mrs. Kathy Grant. And I have to say that I'm a follower of your Facebook page also. She's an historian from Black Canadian Veterans Voices. And from Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, we have with us Mr. Mervyn Bouvier, qui est un ministre des Anciens Combattants, et John Bélanger.
Mr. Mervyn Bouvier is a minister of Veterans Affairs, and John Bélanger, who is a veteran. So on that, I will ask the members of the committee if they would like to adjourn. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you to our interpreters and to the clerk and analysts.
Rencontre ta journée.